Greetings, friends, and welcome to our Wednesday or any other day Bible study. We've been for a few weeks now on Jesus, and that's really been a delightful series. Gosh, Jesus and the Gospels have been with it. It was so good. Jesus and mental health, that was well worth pondering. Jesus and youth, Jesus, it's been terrific. Jesus and music, thank you for tuning in for these. They're all archived. You can find them easily on our YouTube channel. There's playlists of Jesus and. Today, I thought it would be, as Lent is beginning, to talk about Jesus and the desert. If you lived in Israel in the time of Jesus, you're always on the edge of the desert, or you're in the desert. Jesus stays in the desert for a while. Jesus walks through deserts. It's just always right there for people. The desert evokes, that Israel, was enslaved down in Egypt, which is like a big desert, except for the Nile River running down the middle of it. And then God delivered them from Egypt, and they're in the desert for a long time, coming into the Promised Land, which has its own share of desert. It becomes a parable, right? The Bible itself already speaks of the wilderness, the desert, as like that's a spiritual state. The land's a parable in Israel. To this day, water supply is a big issue. Where are we going to find water? They have to be very careful about it. It's generally a dry land, not much water. So people there always know, like, we got to find water. Where's water? Huge issue. Big spiritual issue for us too, right? So I thought it'd be fun to talk about Jesus and the desert. So in Mark chapter 1, we read that the Spirit drove Jesus out into the desert. He was in the desert for 40 days being tested by the devil. I love, at least in the Saguaro National Park, Jesus' desert did not look like this with cacti around, although these cacti I think are really interesting. They're reaching up in a dry and barren place. It's almost like arms, hands lifted toward heaven in prayer. We're going to talk in this Bible study about what it means to be like in a wilderness place, in a desert place, speaking with God and reaching up. So actually the desert where Jesus went for those 40 days looks a lot like this, minus the cacti. Think about these cacti. Each one's unique. They're all doing the same thing. They're growing in a dry and barren land. So it's like a little church of people, right, trying to grow toward God in the wilderness. Before we got off the hotel, they said, take water, take sunscreen. It's dangerous out here. You're doing a hard thing. That's how we grow closer to God. So thinking about Jesus in the desert, I thought of, I just couldn't think of anybody better to talk to about I can't think of anybody better to talk to about anything, but certainly this, I wanted to bring on the Reverend Sarah Howell-Miller. Sarah has a recognizable first half of her last name, which is the same as mine. I've known her all her life. Sarah's the senior pastor at Green Street Methodist Church in Winston-Salem. Sarah, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've been on our studies before, and people always love the things you have to say, and it's great fun. So we're thinking about Jesus in the desert. You probably, like I did, you actually preached on this just Sunday, right?
Yes, I did.
Jesus, I love it. Jesus went to, the word desert is interesting, like a deserted place, a deserted place. I thought it would be fun to start with kind of an unusual thing. You live right around the corner, and your church is not far also, from Salem Baptist Church, where your great-grandfather, whom you never met, whom I never met, Charles Stevens, Granddaddy Stevens, he died a couple years before I met Lisa. I knew his wife, Grace, as did you. She was your great-grandmother. She was wonderful. And he pastored Salem Baptist Church, founded Piedmont Bible College there, and he wrote a book called The Wilderness Journey. Have you read this? I'm trying to remember.
I've read part of it.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am. I gather it's a series of sermons that he preached on the book of Numbers when the Israelites are out in the wilderness. And what he does is he takes the wilderness, the desert, as sort of a spiritual state, the image of a barren place you're going through. Talk about that. How's the desert sort of an image, a vivid image of what happens, where we live?
Yeah, I kind of played with this idea of desert and wilderness as metaphor in my sermon yesterday, but from a couple different angles. And I think kind of the most common way that we think about or talk about the desert is that barren place, that dry place, that place of isolation, and even, whether positive or negative, it might represent disconnection or even sacred solitude. And so that is a powerful metaphor for spiritual life, for moments of discernment, for seeking God's presence, or even feeling God's absence or the absence of people around us. But one thing that I talked about yesterday was kind of saying there's that side of the wilderness and the desert, which we see in Scripture, but we also see the desert as a place of encounter with God. And so not this past Sunday, the Sunday before, my associate pastor and I had a conversation about the story of Hagar in Genesis 16 and how Hagar runs away from Abraham and Sarah, goes into the desert, into the wilderness, and there she encounters God and actually gives God a name of the God who sees me, El Roy. And Hagar's the only character in the Bible to give God a name. And so even though the wilderness is a dangerous place for her, it becomes this place of radical encounter with and claiming God. And I talked a little bit too about how the desert, we think of the desert as dead space and just a kind of an obstacle of between here and there. You could even think about that in the Israelite journey, that the desert was this place of wandering, but that doesn't have to be about deprivation or death necessarily, that there is a lot of life in the desert. And that sometimes the desert is a place where we are called to be more attentive to those signs of life when perhaps we might be sort of numb to it in our everyday lives, when we hear so much life and activity around us all the time. In the desert, it's a place where you have to get quiet and pay attention for presence and for signs of life. So there are a lot of different ways to carry a metaphor of wilderness or desert into spirituality and faith.
Yeah, I mean, in the desert, the usual protections, comforts are stripped away, and it's sort of you and the elements, and you realize your dependence, that life is risky. I love signs of life in the desert. Your mom and I were out in Arizona. We hiked through the desert. It's hot. And they warned us, like take water, take sunscreen, wear a hat. But then you see just little things that are growing in the midst of heat and total sand. There's still life there somehow. Now, people, I know when you were in school, you would have studied who we call the desert fathers. Back in the 4th and 5th century in Syria and Turkey, there were these people who they fled city life and they went to live in the desert. And that just sounds crazy, except our friend Jason Bassett wrote a book about those desert fathers. There were some women too, but the desert fathers, he said they were the rock stars of the ancient church, right? So here were these spiritual heroes, and people came out to see them. One was named, what's his name? Simeon Stylites, right? And he lived on top of a stone pillar. This is like the ultimate in social distancing, right? He lived up on a pillar for 37 years, but he wasn't alone, because people came out and asked him to pray for them, to give them spiritual counsel. He would say things. This guy named St. Anthony lived to 105. And in the ancient church, people thought of these guys as like their heroes, their models for how to be a Christian. It was quiet out there, didn't have comforts, possessions, and they weren't rejecting possessions. They were just renouncing them. Real season of dependence, trying to master themselves, testing themselves. Can they be holy? Can they be wise? This takes solitude. It takes time. What's your kind of lingering impression of those desert or Macarinas? It was a woman, right? The desert fathers, mothers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of wisdom that's been passed down from folks who have kind of stepped away from the world, they're still a part of the world, just in a very different way. And I think that it's laudable to think about their dedication, their spiritual practice, and especially that image of people coming to ask for prayers from them, that there isn't as much disconnection as we might think that there would have been. I think that my sort of pause around some of that is this lauding them as here. We can appreciate and honor, but anytime we start thinking about hierarchies, this is something that I get a lot, and probably you do too as a pastor, where I am in a group of lay people and I say, who would like to pray? And nobody wants to pray because there's a professional prayer in our midst. Well, but that's not prayer is all of our work. And the same could
there's
be.
not a course. There's not a course in seminary of leading prayers 101. It's just not a course.
Right. No.
Yeah.
But I think about that, this sense that there are some people who are experts, some people that have more credence in terms of being able to even talk to God, and acknowledging that while, we might look up to some of these desert fathers, that we all have spaces where we can and do encounter God in those ways. I talked in my sermon yesterday, I talked about, we don't necessarily have to move to the desert in order to become holy, but we can make little deserts in our own lives. For thinking about, especially in Lent, is a great time to think about what might help us to make space for those kinds of encounters, because that's a lot of what the desert offers, both literally and metaphorically, is space for encounter. So
Yeah, and it's not, and they are. I think for a long time, I thought these guys went out in the desert and you just lived alone. You were never around anybody. But they actually had communities out in the desert of people striving to be sort of like Thomas Merton, famous writer. He lived at Gethsemane in an abbey with other monks. So they're devoted to quiet and solitude, but you still got to get along with other people. And it's as hard for those guys as everybody else. Rowan Williams wrote a great book about that called Where God Happens. It's just kind of things that those desert fathers said about other people. My favorite quote being from Moses the Black, who said, if you have a corpse laid out in your own front room, you won't have the leisure to go to a neighbor's funeral. It's just like wonderful. It's like the speck in the eye and the law.
yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, so now there are different deserts, right? I know you've had a long attachment to Julian of Norwich.
Mm-hmm.
Julian didn't live in a desert. She lived in the city of Norwich. You and I visited there years ago. But she lived alone. She isolated herself in a cell for years. Like, why is somebody like Julian? And I thought during the pandemic, she should be like the patron saint, right? Because she lived during the plague and she was isolated and she was a stay-at-home. Talk about Julian and why somebody like that matters to you and might matter to us.
Yeah, there's a lot that I could say about Julian, of course, and it has been interesting in the complicated, icky sense of that term, perhaps, to reflect on her legacy in the midst of a pandemic right now, because we are so much seeing that in the last several years, being around people can be dangerous in a way that maybe we didn't think about it the same way before. But that was very much the case in Julian's time during the Black Death. And she herself became very, very ill and near death herself. And that's when she had all of these visions of God's abundant love. And it was kind of a closet universalist. She never quite says that she, thinks everyone is saved, but that's sort of the import of her visions, is that God made, loves, and sustains this whole creation, and that we are all kin. That's a big part of what she had, and her visions are very visceral and fleshy. I think it's really interesting in a moment where she was probably, I assume, feeling very detached from or even betrayed by her body, as we sometimes do when we have chronic pain or illness or anything else going wrong in our bodies, that even in that moment, she was having these physical visions of God making us all kin, making us all family. And that even in that isolation, there was this deep sense of connection to God and to other people that she wanted to write down and share with the world. And the earliest writing we have from a woman in English is what became of Julian's visions.
And one of the great theologians in the history of the church. And it's a little shocking because it was like a guy's world back then. But her stuff's, I thought about this new book out on hymns, and I did a little section on the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul. And a lot of people like to talk about the shipwreck and why the guy wrote the hymn. But what's interesting to me is the saying, It Is Well. Julian, her most famous thing, every seminarian remembers it if they don't remember anything else about Julian, and she said, all will be well. And I thought about that. There's something about thinking about God and saying all will be well. Just the saying it brings a kind of peace, a kind of it almost becomes well because you articulate it and you think these are words. This is what Jesus said to Julian in that cell. But all will be well. You resonate to that.
Yeah, and it's I saw a meme in the last year or two. There's this famous meme that goes around there's a dog with a top hat sitting at a table drinking coffee, and the room around him is on fire. And it just zooms in on him, and he has a little speech bubble that says, "This is fine." And anyway, this has been pervasive. But somebody on Twitter took that, but they put Julian of Norwich's head on the dog, and instead of "This is fine," it says, "All will be well. All will be well." Anyway, but and a lot of it was kind of, this was, at the very beginning of the pandemic when I came across this, and thinking of the world is on fire all around us, and yet all will be well. And what does that even mean? We're actually at my church, we're going to explore that. We're doing a Tuesday night study called "It Is Well," with the footnote, "or it isn't," and kind of asking what it means to say "it is well." What are we talking about when we talk about wellness? It's a complicated thing. It's almost I can sometimes think of that as a form of resistance in the midst of not wellness in the world.
That's always I love that. That's a cool meme. Like that. I've been reading Thomas Merton's journals lately, devotionally for myself. I need to look up the quote, but somewhere he says, that in solitude, which is you're not alone, you're with God. He said your soul can stay still. The world's moving, rushing, but your soul stays in the same place, right? That's kind of an ideal. Let's think about. So she lived in a cell. Thomas Merton, lived in an abbey in Kentucky. It's along that Bourbon Trail up there. This whole thing of building a building out in the middle of the wilderness somewhere. I think you were in the group of young clergy that I took to Israel, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. And we went to that in the Judean desert, what's supposed to be the vicinity where Jesus was. And there's a monastery there, and it clings to the side of this cliff. Like, how do they build that there? What that idea that like you're right on the edge, it's absolutely amazing. Talk about how you have an experience with a monastery. Tell our folks about that. I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, so if you drive 75 miles north of Santa Fe and then drive down a 13-mile dirt road into the Chama River Canyon Wilderness, you come to Christ in the Desert Monastery. And I had the privilege, I actually spent 3 of my college spring breaks there because there was a group at my school that would take undergrads to this monastery over spring break. And this was always during the season of Lent, so it was particularly meaningful to be there in that time. But it's
this is a little different than the beach trip to Florida.
A little different. I was always a little self-conscious about my super uncool spring break plans. But you get out there and you're truly, there are miles and miles of government protected wilderness all around you. There are these big red cliffs and a river and this beautiful adobe chapel. The monks' living quarters are attached to that. There's a guest house a short walk away. And that's pretty much it. There's they open their services. They have seven times a day prayer. This is a Benedictine monastery, so they follow this rhythm of ora et labora, work and prayer. And so prayers start at 4 a.m. with vigils and then happen throughout the day. And in between, the monks are engaged in different kinds of work. They actually grow hops and create beer there. So that's part of their work is tending to the hops. But then a number of them, it's interesting because it is so isolated and so disconnected from the world. And yet some of the monks have different lines of work. One time when I was there was one monk who was actually a video game developer. So he was doing some of that work and would occasionally leave the monastery to go to conferences around that. But then he would come back to this life of prayer and seclusion. And it's an incredible place. I went back also after college as an adult with my husband, and it takes some adjustment to get used to not hearing the sounds of traffic or really much of anything aside from a bell calling you to prayers or to meals, or the sounds of coyotes at night in a canyon, very distinctive sound. But that has become a important place to me spiritually, just for the space, against the space that it has made for me to be present, to engage in rhythms, because that it's not just open dead space, it's sort of rhythmically structured space in terms of their their lives there. But it's also structured around kind of the rising and setting of the sun. There's solar power and electricity, but when the sun goes down, it's kind of that's about it. You should probably just go on to bed. So it's just a very different way of life, but deeply communal. And Thomas Merton actually visited there a number of times, as did Georgia O'Keeffe. It's very close to Ghost Ranch. So yeah, it's a special place. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Been Zooming for 2 years and still can't remember to unmute. So one thing I've never heard you reflect on this. Let me ask this. When you go somewhere like Arizona or New Mexico, one of the things that you can't not notice is Native American culture and religion. And I don't know if that's part of Christ in the Desert Monastery, but in a place like that, you realize there were people who lived in that desert way before any Christians showed up, and they have some understandings of God, earth, life. Is that a thing there?
So, and it's interesting because I don't know that I was super attuned to those kinds of questions the last time I was there, but I'm hoping to go back soon, and I'm going to be interested because there is definitely a lot of influence of like Mexican culture and Spanish language. So you get some of that diversity, but there is that sense of, Spanish missions started popping up in that area hundreds of years ago, kind of Catholics colonizing a space. And so I'm not as familiar in that immediate area with some of the more indigenous cultures, but have been trying in recent years to read more and pay more attention to indigenous voices, particularly around spirituality, and trying not to, I think it's easy for white folks to kind of fetishize indigenous spirituality or think that it's about being one with nature. And nature is an important piece. And also, indigenous spirituality is not a monolith, but it's been eye-opening for me to just try to learn more and educate myself more. So I'm hoping that the next time I'm in that area, there's more of that thoughtfulness. Even we have a family wedding in Santa Fe in September, and even looking into some of there's a big Santa Fe festival that weekend, and I've been doing a little reading about it. And there's been some controversy locally around the festival was really started to celebrate the Spanish conquest of that area. And there are people who pushed back and said, this is really problematic. How do we reclaim indigenous ownership of this place? So that's something that I'm interested to pay more attention to the next time I'm in that area.
And you brought up Georgia O'Keeffe. We'll have to go back to the Georgia O'Keeffe place there where they have all these paintings of hers, which, as I recall, you and your mom and your sister took about an hour to see. My son Noah and we buzzed that place in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Another big flower. Different people have different tastes, right, in art and in spirituality. There are different things, but then still, how do we grow? Probably everybody's cutting edge is we need more silence. We need more quiet to shut off the social media. I remember going on a silent retreat before you were born with a bunch of clergy, and they said, you can't talk. And this was especially for a lot of clergy. There's yackers, right? It was murder. And so the first day, like, this was hard. The second day, it was kind of cool. It was like a relief. I don't have to talk. By the third day, I didn't want to hear anybody talk anymore. I didn't want to hear any. It was the silence was, but you have to adjust to it. You have to work on it. And the idea that monks doing these things in monasteries, I'm always moved by that. Like Jesus says, pray without ceasing. There are monasteries all over this world, and somebody's praying there now, and they have their routines. When I do my St. Francis pilgrimage, I take people to a place called Laverno, which is where St. Francis way up in the mountains went and prayed and had this vision of Christ there. What's cool is I tell people, we'll go there at 3:00 any day, and I'll tell you what'll happen. If you're like, you sure it's today? Yeah, every day at 3:00. So the monks who live there, they have this procession, they pick up a cross and they chant, and it's in Italian, but it's the most moving thing in the world. But I mean, every day at 3, they do that. So you went to Christ in the Desert, and you've been back, and you want to go again. I said in my sermon 2 weeks ago that when I take people to Israel, they always come home and say, that was a transformative experience. And I've thought about that because I've been 25 times. I should be so holy by now. with that many. But I said to the people that with God, time it's not linear, it's cyclical. Time turns. Like it's Lent. You can't say I did Lent 17 years ago, I'm done. I did Ash Wednesday in 92. I got ashes, then I'm done. You do it again. It's Lent again. It's Holy Week again. It's Sunday again. We say these same prayers every week. What that's kind of a thing at a place like Christ in the Desert. And I wonder how it can be for people that live in Charlotte, Winston-Salem, other places. Time is a cycle.
Yeah, and I think even when we have a transformative experience, that doesn't, it's hard to carry that with us beyond that experience, especially if we're in a place that is so different from our everyday lives. We often need but two things. One, ways to practice whatever it is that we want to bring with us. And we need opportunities to go back and draw from those wells again. I had an experience last summer that it wasn't in the desert, but with a backpacking and adventure ministry called Wilderness Trail. I went with some folks from our youth group at church, and it was 5 nights camping and hiking on the Appalachian Trail and some other trails in Virginia. No cell phones, no watches, no nothing. And that was such a healing and I might say transformative experience. But just because I did it that one time, it's, I left some of my peace on that trail when I came back, and it is difficult to carry that with us. And so we do need these practices of, we may not have a week to be in silent retreat at a monastery, but we can grab 20 minutes in the morning as a reminder, as a practice of that. And I think that's something that even as a teenager, I thought through of, we would go on these mission trips and have what we called mountaintop experiences of feeling really spiritual and engaged. And then we'd come home and the world around us was the same as it was when we left. And that is inertia that pulls us back into that. And I remember at some point realizing that this was a pattern and feeling really disappointed about this. And, but trying to figure out how to say, we might get to have these transformative experiences once in a while, but we need to be seeking transformation in our everyday lives again and again. And, I think about that not only just with silence or prayer or spirituality, but with things like anti-racism. We might attend a workshop that feels really transformative, but if we're not implementing it in our daily lives, it has not done that transformation. And all of this is lifelong work. John Wesley talked about sanctification as a lifelong process. So even these big moments of feeling like you get a glimpse into something really different, in order for that to really make change over time, we have to practice and implement that.
And you got to decide. I remember years ago taking high school seniors from our church to a CC, and we went on a long walk one day, and I realized kids had earbuds in. And I said, no phones, no. And it was the funniest thing. We walked for about an hour and we stopped, and they said, I heard the wind. I heard a bird. I mean, they were so jazzed up about this. But you come back and you put the earbuds back in when you come home. So how do you find little things? I don't know, Wendy Farley, we've talked about her. She gave me a great podcast. She wrote a book recently. And she said, just find little things like, let's say you're a stressed mom and you just can't find, if you take the garbage out, just don't come right back in. Just, no one's going to notice. Just linger 3 extra minutes. Just be quiet. I love that. Just finding little places where you can do that, but maybe occasionally going away somewhere like Christ, somewhere where you can be quiet. People they have 3 vacation weeks. I give the church one, and we usually say go on a mission trip, but I wonder about, could you give us one where you pray? I don't know. You ever gotten people to do that?
It is hard, and we have, our culture is so much about doing, and it is, I think it even is tricky in thinking about missions, that so much of our focus is on doing, and it should be in a sense, but it also should be learning and listening. I've seen some folks experimenting with kind of different kinds of mission trips in recent years where there is some action, but there's more kind of learning and listening. Even at my last church, we had a relationship with a ministry in Haiti and went there a number of times. And it was kind of tough to get some of our folks out of the mindset of we have to accomplish X, Y, and Z to help them, when really like what we needed to do was to sit there and listen to their stories and understand more about what was going on in that local community, and then think about what that meant for our community back home. But that is not we're not good at sitting and listening, but it's an important piece of spirituality and of justice action.
I mean, so American, right? So Jesus, so his life skill was he was a builder. But in his ministry, it's not like he goes and builds a house for somebody in Capernaum, right? He doesn't do that. He's just with people. When you were a kid, we had an associate named Andy Baxter, and he took a group of Davidson College students to Nicaragua. And I love when they came back, people say, "What'd y'all build?" Nothing. Well, what was your mission? He said it was a reverse mission. They were in mission to us. And this just confused church people. And he could talk about it just in a lovely way. And I know anytime I've been in a mission field with anybody, what matters is that you showed up. You know, there's a woman in Lithuania. We still talk periodically. We did some work there, but it doesn't matter. We've been friends now for 20 years. And she wishes me happy birthday, and you have a relationship, and that's what people really are hungry for. Any last thoughts for our people on sort of Jesus and the desert?
Not that I can think of.
One of the things we talk about forever, but I'd have to get you on sometime to talk about Julian of Norwich. That would really be an amazing thing. Anyhow, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. Our people are always blessed by you, and we're grateful.